I want to talk about 6 rules for writing a straight news lead. And following these rules will help you write a good lead every single time. Remember that totally made up news story we looked at earlier, the one about the made up fire in Bragg Room 104? Once formatted and published in a newspaper, whether in print or online format, the story might look like this. An editor would have added a headline to the story. That's the big text at the top of the story. And the editor also would have added a byline to identify the story's author. Now, we won't write headlines in this class. You learn that in an editing course, which is a whole different course from this one. But I want you to note the telegraphic language that headlines typically use. This is important because when I ask students to write me a lead, they often write me a headline, and that's not the same thing. The two sound very different. For example, this headline reads, "Projector Fire Cancels Bragg Building Classes." You see how kind of stilted and strange that sounds. If you were telling a friend of yours about this story, you wouldn't go up to your friend and say, "Projector Fire Cancels Bragg Building Classes." No, you wouldn't do that. You would use natural conversational English language. If you wrote this idea in that standard conversational language, the idea in this headline would be expressed with a sentence like, "A projector fire canceled classes in the Bragg building on Monday." Do you see how much more normal and conversational that sounds compared to this sort of telegraphic language that is reserved for headlines? Now, headlines are written this way because they have to match the width of the story that they're on top of, even though they're using bigger type. So the goal is on expressing a lot of information in a very few number of words. And so to save space, headline writers will omit articles like a, an, and the. They'll drop verb tense cues. Verbs get converted to the present tense, and all sorts of details get omitted. So don't write your leads in that sort of headline language. Don't ever do that. You'll lose points as a result. So that's the thing to see, is kind of the difference between the way a headline is phrased and the way a lead is phrased. So I want to focus today on these techniques for writing the all-important first paragraph of the story. Journalists call this first paragraph the lead, pronounced lead, and sometimes spelled L-E-D-E. There are many kinds of leads, or question leads, and teaser leads, and feature leads, and delayed leads, and all sorts of things. You'll learn about those in your more advanced writing courses. In this class, we'll focus on the most common, most basic type of lead, the straight news lead. So let's zoom in on this lead and look at some particulars about it and how the 6 rules apply to it. So a straight news lead has to do several things, and difficult things, and it has to do them all at the same time. That's why they're so hard to write. It has to accurately summarize the story's most important information. It also has to interest a reader in reading the rest of the story, so it's an attention getter. As a result, it has to be short, has to be organized, simple, and clear. All those things. And in real-world journalism, you have to write a lead quickly because you've got a deadline to beat, typically. So making all that happen is not easy. Writing leads is difficult. Unfortunately, we have to start there rather than build up to it. But I think with a little practice, you'll be able to do this pretty well. Okay, so here are the 6 rules. Follow each of these all at once, and you'll write a good straight news lead every single time. Let's go through the rules one at a time and see how this lead illustrates each one. Rule number 1 says that a straight news lead should be a single paragraph consisting of a single sentence. Okay, so this lead does that. It's a single sentence: "Smoke from an electrical fire drove dozens of students and their professor out of a packed lecture hall on MTSU's campus Thursday afternoon." That's all one sentence. And it would be in a paragraph all by itself, not with an additional sentence, not with an additional 2 or 3 sentences. This is not your English composition class. This is journalism class. And in journalism, that lead is a single paragraph all by itself. The rest, after you type afternoon, you'll hit the enter key and you'll start a new paragraph. Okay, so don't make that mistake. That's an easy one to follow. This one's a little tougher. The lead has to have no more than 30 words, 30 or fewer words, and yes, I do count them. There's a function in Microsoft Word and also in Google Docs that will count words for you, or you can just count them. So make sure that count doesn't exceed 30 words. And the point of that is to keep the lead short and interesting. The lead also has to summarize the most newsworthy what, where, and when elements of the story. So that happens in this lead. The what is this idea of smoke from an electrical fire driving students out of their classroom. Okay. The where is right there in the phrase on MTSU's campus. So that tells you where this happened. And the when is Thursday afternoon. That's when it happened. Notice that neither the where nor the when has to be all that specific. This isn't Thursday afternoon at 4:01 p.m. or something like that, nor is it, in room 104 of the Bragg Lecture Building on MTSU's campus. That information can wait for later in the story. You don't have a lot of room in the lead, so just give kind of a general indication of the where and the when. That's kind of all you have room for. Rule number 2 says that the lead's first verb should express the main what of the story and should be placed among the lead's first 7 words. Now, by what, the main what I mean there is the piece of information or the aspect of the story that you think would be most interesting or most engaging for the audience that you are writing the story for. So here I'm imagining that my audience would primarily be other MTSU students, and they probably would be most interested in the idea that students had to evacuate this classroom because of smoke from this electrical fire. So to convey that main what, I chose the subject-verb combination smoke drove, and I placed the first verb, which is drove, among the lead's first 7 words. So it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the 6th word in. See that? So and what this rule does is it forces you to talk about the main what of the story right at the beginning of the lead. If you wait and you talk about this at the end of the lead, you're doing what editors call backing into the lead. You're putting a bunch of less interesting information right at the beginning and making your audience wait for the information that they'll be most interested in. Remember, a part of a lead's job is to grab the reader and interest the reader right up front. That's why the main what needs to be right there at the beginning of the lead, expressed in the subject and first verb combination within the first 7 words. So that's the reason for this rule. So that's about forcing you to tell the news of the story quickly. Rule number 3 says the lead's first verb, that same one we just talked about, the one that expresses the main what of the story, should be active voice, not passive voice. Now this gets a little bit technical, but I think you'll be able to understand it if you just practice a little bit. So we've already figured out the first verb is drove, right? Now, if you think about active voice, what that means is that the subject, or the verb rather, makes the subject do something. It makes it take action. So if we write smoke drove students, do you see how the verb drove it indicates that its subject, smoke, did something. Smoke did something. What did it do? It drove the students out of the room, right? So that's action, and that's the hallmark of active voice. Active voice happens when the verb indicates that the subject was active, that it was taking or has taken or did take or will take some kind of action. Passive voice, on the other hand, happens when the verb indicates that the subject is being acted upon, that the subject is having something done to it. Here, for example, would be the passive voice version of what I just said. Instead of smoke drove students out of the room, students were driven out of the room by smoke. Do you see here how the verb is were driven and its subject, students, the verb is saying that the students were acted upon. They had something done to them by some third party or force or object in the sentence. And in this case, it's smoke. So students were driven out of the room by the smoke. So test yourself for a couple of times here. What voice would this be? Students fled. Is that active voice or is that passive voice? What do you think? Well, that would be active voice because the verb is fled, the subject is students, and the verb fled indicates that students did something. What did students do? They fled. They ran out of the room. How about this one? Smoke has driven. Well, again, think about the subject and the verb. The verb is has driven, okay? And the subject is smoke. So is the verb indicating that smoke did something or that smoke had something done to it? Well, smoke did something. It has driven, or it has done something, I guess. Smoke has driven, in this case, students out of the room where the fire was. How about this one? Students are fleeing. What do you think? Active voice or passive voice? Well, again, this is active voice. The verb is are fleeing, and the subject is students. And the verb is indicating that students did something. They or are doing something. They are fleeing. They aren't having something done to them. They aren't being made to fled or something like that. They are actually fleeing. They're taking action. How about this one? Students have been driven. Well, this one is passive voice because, again, look at the subject and verb. The verb is have been driven. The subject is students. So is the verb indicating that the subject did something or had something done to it? Well, students had something done to them in this case. They were driven. They have been driven out of the room by the smoke. So that would be an example of passive voice. Rule number 4 says that if there is a who involved in the story, and sometimes there isn't, but if there's a who involved in the story, the lead should give some indication of who the who is. Now, in the example lead, the who would be the students and the professor who got run out of the classroom by this fire that broke out. And that would be an important thing to mention in the lead because it's a more important story if there was somebody who was threatened by the fire than if it was just a fire that broke out in an empty room, for example. Specifying the who can get a little bit tricky. You have to ask yourself, for example, if the who that is mentioned in the lead is famous. And by famous, I mean recognizable by name immediately by the people in whatever audience you're writing the story for. So, for example, suppose President Joe Biden had, against all probability, been giving a guest lecture in the room at the time that the fire broke out. Well, you would want to put his name in the story because everybody in the audience, whether they like him or whether they don't, is going to recognize him by name. So your lead would be smoke forced President Joe Biden and dozens of students to flee a packed lecture hall on MTSU's campus Thursday afternoon. So in that case, you would name the who in the lead, give the person's actual name. But most of the time, the who is simply not going to be that well known. And so in that case, you want to save the name of the who for later in the story. And that's what I did in this example lead. None of these students were famous, not even the professor is famous. So instead of giving names in the lead, I just told you that students and some nameless professor were affected by the fire. And I'll give at least the name of the professor later in the story. Rule number 5 says the lead should summarize the why and the how of the story, but only if there's room. Remember, you only have 30 or fewer words to use in this lead, so there may or may not be room in the lead for the why and the how elements. In this lead, the why would be the that electrical fire. And the lead mentions that as the why, as to what caused this fire. However, notice how easy it would be to leave it out. You could write a lead that just said smoke drove dozens of students and a professor out of a packed lecture hall on MTSU's campus Thursday afternoon, and that would be a fine story or a fine lead for the story. But because there's room and because a little bit of extra detail makes the lead more interesting, I went ahead and added the phrase from an electrical fire in the lead for this story. Rule 6 is just as important as the rest of them, even though it comes at the end. If what is in the lead needs to be attributed, then you need to place the attribution at the end of the lead. Attribution is simply an indication of the source of the information that you're reporting. And if you do include attribution, if it's necessary, then be sure you put it at the end. So it would look like this if I were to add attribution to this lead. Out of a packed lecture hall at MTSU's campus Thursday afternoon, comma, notice the comma, a Murfreesboro fire official said. Attribution, when it comes to the end like this, is always introduced with a comma, so don't forget that. And again, the Murfreesboro fire official is not famous, right? So I left the name of that official out. I would probably give the official's name later in the story. Another structure you can use is this according to structure. Out of a packed lecture hall on MTSU's campus Thursday afternoon, comma, according to an MTSU statement. Many editors will tell you to use some form of the verb to say, in this case said, if the source is a person, because people can say things, but use according to if the source is some inanimate object, like a statement or a letter or an email or a text message or something like that. Because those things, because they're not people, they can't actually say things. They can just show information or something like that. Whatever you do, don't do this. Don't write, a Murfreesboro fire official said Thursday that smoke from an electrical fire drove, and then on with the rest of the lead. The problem with this structure is that, remember, a lead's job is to grab the reader's interest right up front. So if you begin the lead with this idea that a Murfreesboro fire official has said something, that's not especially interesting. It's kind of a snoozer, because fire officials and officials generally say things all the time. And almost every story could start with some version of somebody said that and then the actual news. If you put the attribution at the end of the lead, though, what it does is it leaves room at the front of the lead for the information that is really unique and interesting and newsworthy about this particular story. So notice, too, that if you start with the attribution, most of the time you're going to violate rule number 1, which says that rule number 2, the one that says that the subject-verb combination that expresses the main what of the story needs to appear in the first 7 words of the lead. Well, the main what of the story is not a Murfreesboro fire official said. I mean, said is a verb, and it's got a subject, official. It's even active voice, but it's just not the most interesting thing about the story. So shove that attribution to the end of the lead and start with what the news is.